The man who rode into Dusty Creek on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1878 had a folded piece of paper in his breast pocket, a name written on it in someone else's handwriting, and absolutely no intention of keeping his mouth shut about any of it. Hugh Easton pulled his roan mare to a slow stop at the edge of the main road, which was really just a wide strip of packed earth running between two rows of wooden buildings, and squinted at the town through the bright April glare. Dusty Creek, Texas. Population, according to the faded sign nailed to a post at the road's edge, was 412. Hugh suspected that number had not been updated in some years, and he planned to ask about that too. He was 26 years old, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar and eyes the color of good bourbon held up to firelight. He had ridden 3 days from San Antonio with a commission from a man named Garrett Hale, who was a lawyer of middling reputation and excellent tailoring, and who had handed Hugh the folded paper across a desk piled with ledgers and told him, in the flattest voice Hugh had ever heard a human being produce, not to ask questions. Hugh had asked 4 before he even left the office. He had learned this much. A woman named Sallie Morgan lived somewhere in or around Dusty Creek, Texas. She was to be found and informed that she had inherited property. The property was a ranch, apparently. The previous owner, whose name Garrett Hale had declined to share in any detail, had died some weeks prior under circumstances that the lawyer described only as complicated. Hugh was to locate Sallie Morgan, deliver a sealed envelope that sat in his saddlebag next to a clean shirt, and then presumably ride back to San Antonio and collect a fee that was, he had to admit, generous enough that he had agreed despite the deliberate fog of information surrounding the job. He had asked on his way out of the office whose ranch it was. Hale had said it was complicated. Hugh had asked what had happened to the previous owner. Complicated again. He had asked whether Sallie Morgan knew she was inheriting anything. Hale had looked at him over his spectacles and said, in that terrible flat voice, that he was not to ask questions, and that if Hugh wanted to be paid he would ride to Dusty Creek and deliver the envelope. Hugh had ridden, but he had not stopped wondering. He swung down from the saddle now and looped his mare's reins around the post outside what appeared to be a general store. The town smelled of horse and dust, and somewhere, distantly, baking bread. A cat sat in the window of the dry goods building across the road and regarded him with the particular ancient indifference that cats reserve for strangers. 2 men in suspenders were having a conversation outside the barber shop, and they both stopped talking to look at him. Hugh touched the brim of his hat at them. "Morning," he said. "I'm looking for a woman named Sallie Morgan. Either of you know where I might find her?" The 2 men exchanged a look. The taller one, with a jaw like a fence post, scratched the back of his neck. "You a lawman?" "No, sir," Hugh said. "Just a man with an errand." "What kind of errand?" "The kind that involves finding Sallie Morgan," Hugh said pleasantly. He had a way of being agreeable that people sometimes found mildly infuriating because it gave them nothing to push against. The shorter man, who had a red mustache and kind eyes, seemed to soften a little. "Miss Sallie runs the schoolhouse," he said. "Well, she did. School's not in session, it being Tuesday. This time of day she's likely at the Morgan place, about 2 miles east on the creek road. You will know it by the broken fence post at the gate. Her father never did get around to fixing that." Hugh thanked them, noted with interest the word father and the past tense in which it was deployed, and climbed back onto his mare. The creek road was narrow and pleasant, running between scrubby live oaks that threw dappled shade across the path. The spring had been wet enough that the grass on either side was still green, and the creek itself was running high, glinting between the trees in long silver flashes. Hugh rode with his hands easy on the reins and his mind working through the pieces he had. Father, past tense. A woman who ran the schoolhouse. A ranch she apparently did not know she was inheriting. A lawyer who would not answer questions. He found the broken fence post exactly where the man with the red mustache had said it would be. Beyond it, A dirt track wound through a stand of pecans toward a low white house with a porch that ran the full width of the front. There was a garden to the left side of the house, recently turned earth with the thin green beginnings of something planted in neat rows. There was a barn behind the house, weathered to silver gray, with its doors standing open. And there, on the porch, sitting in a wooden chair with something in her lap that she appeared to be mending, was a woman. Hugh stopped his mare at the gate and looked at her for a moment before she noticed him, which gave him a small window of honest observation that he felt a little guilty about but took anyway. She was, he guessed, around 23 or 24. She had dark brown hair pinned up but escaping in several places, with loose strands falling along the side of her neck in the warm air. Her dress was practical, a deep blue-gray, and her sleeves were rolled to the elbow. She was bent over her mending with the focused, slightly irritated expression of someone whose thread had knotted, and then she looked up. Her eyes were brown and very direct, the kind of eyes that did not look at you from a comfortable distance but came straight to the point. She looked at Hugh on his horse at her gate and did not seem frightened or welcoming either, just careful and watchful in the way of someone who had learned that strangers at your gate were a category of thing that required assessment before response. "Can I help you?" she called. Hugh dismounted and led his mare through the gate, which he carefully unlatched and relatched behind him. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and took off his hat, because his mother had raised him right even if she had not managed to teach him to stop asking questions. "Miss Morgan," he said. "Sallie Morgan." "That's me," she said. She set the mending in her lap and looked at him steadily. "My name is Hugh Easton," he said. "I've ridden from San Antonio. I was sent by a man named Garrett Hale, who is a lawyer there, with some correspondence for you. I want to be up front with you that I don't know much about what's in the correspondence, because Mr. Hale was not particularly forthcoming, though not for lack of me asking." He reached into his coat and produced the sealed envelope. "I'm sorry if this arrives with insufficient explanation. I was told only that it concerns an inheritance." Sallie Morgan stared at him. Then she looked at the envelope. Then she looked back at him with those direct brown eyes. "What kind of inheritance?" she said. "I don't know," Hugh said honestly. "I asked." Something shifted in her expression. Not exactly softening, but a kind of recalibration, like she was placing him in a different category than the one she had initially prepared. She set her mending on the porch railing and came down the 2 steps, and he noticed she was taller than he had expected, coming nearly to his jaw, and that her hands when she took the envelope from him were steady, but her face was not quite. She turned the envelope over. Her name was written on it in the same careful handwriting as the note in Hugh's pocket. He watched her open it, breaking the red wax seal with her thumbnail, and pull out a folded document that was several pages long. She read the first paragraph standing right there at the bottom of the porch steps, and then the color left her face. "Come inside," she said, in a voice that was very controlled. "Please." The inside of the house was neat and spare, the way a house gets when the person living in it is both organized and short of money. There was a table, 4 chairs, a cookstove with a good iron pot on it, a bookshelf with more books than furniture would suggest, and a fireplace over which hung a framed piece of embroidery that read, in careful stitching, "Home is where the work is," which Hugh found honest enough to be charming. Sallie sat at the table and read the full document. Hugh sat in the chair across from her and waited because it seemed like the right thing to do and because he wanted to understand what was happening enough to stay until he did. She read for a long time. He watched her face move through several things he did not have names for. When she finished, she set the pages on the table and pressed her hands flat against them and looked at the wall. "My father died," she said. "Not to him exactly, just saying it." "I am sorry," Hugh said. "We were not close," she said, and then seemed to feel that needed clarification. "He left when I was 11 years old. Went west, further west, which is what men did, and I had my mother and I had this house and I had school and I did not expect to ever hear from him again. My mother passed 3 years ago." She stopped. I have not heard from my father in 12 years. And now Mr. Hale says he left you a ranch, Hugh said quietly. A cattle ranch, she said, in the New Mexico territory. He built it up, apparently. The letter says he built it up over the better part of 15 years, and there are cattle and a house and hands who work the land. And he died 6 weeks ago, and he left all of it to me. She looked at Hugh finally, and he could see she was not sad exactly. She was something more complicated than sad, something that had several layers and none of them were simple. I don't know why he left it to me. I don't know why he didn't sell it, and I don't know why he didn't leave it to someone who was actually there. I was not there. I have never been to New Mexico. The letter doesn't explain his reasoning, Hugh asked. She glanced down at the pages. There is a personal note at the end, she said. From him, not from the lawyer. She did not offer to share it, and he did not ask her to. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, a mockingbird was making an elaborate production of being a variety of other birds in sequence. What happens if I don't want it, she said. I don't know, Hugh said. I assume it would go to whoever is next, or possibly just sit there. I can ride back to San Antonio and ask Mr. Hale those questions if you'd like. You would ride 3 days back just to ask questions. I have a great many questions already, Hugh said. A few more wouldn't trouble me. She looked at him properly for the first time since they had come inside. The wariness was still there, but something else had joined it, something that might have been, if he was reading correctly, the faint beginning of amusement. Who are you, Mr. Easton? What do you normally do when you are not riding around delivering envelopes from lawyers who won't explain themselves? I work, Hugh said. I have done a number of things. I worked cattle drives for a few years, up from Texas to Kansas along the Kishom Trail. I did some land surveying, which I liked because it required measuring things exactly and then writing them down, and I have found that most of the chaos in human affairs comes from people not measuring things carefully enough. I did some work for a marshal's office in San Antonio, which mostly involved tracking people down and asking them questions they did not want to answer. Mr. Hale hired me because of that last part, I think. Sallie Morgan watched him talk with an expression that he could not fully read, but that was paying close attention. You surveyed land, she said. Yes, ma'am. And cattle drives, you know cattle. Reasonably well, he said, and something in his mind began to tick like a clock that has just been wound. And you track people down, she said. I do, he said. She looked at the document under her hands again. The letter says that a man named Cole Briggs is currently running the ranch in my father's absence. He was my father's ranch manager. The letter says I am to come and take possession and that Mr. Briggs will assist me in the transition. She paused. It also says at the bottom in a note from Mr. Hale that there may be some complications regarding the property. Complications, Hugh said, remembering that word from Hale's office with a feeling of deep unsurprise. He does not elaborate, she said. He didn't elaborate for me either, Hugh said. Sallie stood up, which was the kind of standing up that meant thinking was happening, and walked to the window and looked out at the garden she had planted. He could see her working through something, the set of her shoulders changing as she moved through whatever calculation was happening behind those direct brown eyes. I have 23 students, she said, to the window. I have this house, which my mother's family has owned since 1851. I have $2 in a tin under the bed, which I mention not because it is relevant to this conversation, but because you asked who I was and I am answering. I have enough to get through a summer if I am careful, and then I need to work again in the fall. I have a garden that I planted myself and a roof that needs attention on the west side and a stove that works. I have never been to New Mexico. She turned from the window. And I apparently have a cattle ranch. Apparently, Hugh said. I don't know anything about ranching, she said. You could learn, he said. Most people did. She studied him. You said you would go back and ask Mr. Hale questions. I did say that. Would you, she said carefully, be interested in a different proposition? Because I have been sitting here for the last 10 minutes thinking that I cannot do this alone, and also that I do not know who I would trust to do it with me. And you are a stranger who rode 3 days to deliver me an envelope, and who has asked, by my count, at least 6 questions in the last quarter hour without any of them being impertinent, which is a quality I find undervalued. And you know cattle and land, and you apparently have a gift for finding things out." Hugh felt the clock in his mind tick forward in a very specific way. He looked at her, standing in her practical blue-gray dress in her neat spare house with her escaped hair and her direct eyes and her tin with $2 under the bed, and he said, "What is the proposition?" "Ride with me to New Mexico," she said. "Help me understand what I've inherited. Help me figure out what these complications are that Mr. Hale won't explain. Help me decide what to do with a cattle ranch I never asked for and a father I never got to know." Hugh was quiet for a moment, which was unusual for him. "What would you pay me?" he said. "I don't have anything to pay you with," she said, with the direct honesty that seemed to be her default mode. "Except that if the ranch is worth keeping, I would make sure you were compensated fairly once we know what we're dealing with. And I would feed you on the road, and I am told I am a reasonable traveling companion, though admittedly that testimonial comes from me." Hugh looked at his hat, which he was holding in both hands, and thought about it for approximately the length of time it took the mockingbird outside to run through 3 more impressions. "All right," he said. He had asked every question he could think of. He figured the rest of them were in New Mexico. They left 4 days later, which was the amount of time Sallie needed to arrange for her neighbor Mrs. Crane to water the garden and keep an eye on the house, write letters to the 4 families whose children she had been tutoring in preparation for the fall term, pack what she needed into 2 canvas bags and a trunk, and have what was clearly a significant interior argument with herself about whether this was the right decision, which Hugh could observe happening even though she did not articulate it, because he had gotten fairly good at reading people, and Sallie Morgan was not as opaque as she thought she was. He spent those 4 days in a boarding house in town, where he paid for his meals by helping the owner, a widower named Mr. Beckwith, repair a section of the roof. He also, during those 4 days, went back to the 2 men outside the barber shop, and to the woman at the dry goods store, and to the Reverend, and to a man at the livery stable who had been in Dusty Creek for 30 years, and asked every one of them what they knew about Sallie Morgan and what they knew about her father, Robert Morgan, who had apparently left this town in 1866. What he learned was this: Robert Morgan had been a decent enough man, but a restless one, the kind who could not stay put once an idea had taken hold of him. He had left his wife Clara and his daughter Sallie when the girl was 11, and headed west with a group of men who were talking about cattle and land and opportunity, which was a story as old as the West itself. Clara Morgan had not remarried. She had taught school herself, which was where Sallie had learned to love it, and she had raised her daughter alone and said very little about Robert to anyone. She had died 3 years ago of a fever that came on fast and did not let go. Sallie had been 21 and had taken over the school and had kept going in the way that people do when there is nothing else to do. Nobody in Dusty Creek knew anything about a ranch in New Mexico. Nobody knew Robert Morgan had done well. The general consensus seemed to be that he had probably come to a bad end somewhere on the frontier, which was also a story as old as the West itself, and that Sallie was better off without the worry of it. Hugh wrote all of this in a small notebook he carried and felt, with each page, both more informed and more aware of how much he did not know. On the morning they left, Sallie came to the edge of town on a gray horse named Patience, which she said she had named ironically, and with her 2 canvas bags tied behind the saddle. She wore a brown riding skirt and a cream-colored blouse and a hat that had seen some years but sat straight on her head, and she looked, Hugh thought, exactly like someone who had made a decision and intended to stick with it. "Good morning, Mr. Easton," she said. "Miss Morgan," he said. "Ready." "I am terrified," she said, with the same tone a person might use to say it was going to be a warm day. "But yes." They rode west. The road from Dusty Creek toward the New Mexico territory was not one road but several roads becoming each other, and the country it ran through changed gradually the way seasons change, so slowly that you didn't notice until you looked back at where you had come from. The limestone hills of central Texas gave way to drier, flatter land, and the oaks thinned out, and the sky got bigger, which is a thing that sounds like a figure of speech until you are actually standing under it, and you realize that the sky in West Texas is not the same object as the sky in more eastern places. It is larger and more opinionated. They talked. He had not fully anticipated how much they would talk, but it turned out that Sallie Morgan, once she had decided to trust a person, was extremely willing to talk, and had opinions about nearly everything she had ever encountered, and was interested in nearly everything she had not yet encountered. She asked him about the cattle drives, and he told her about them, the long months moving thousands of longhorns north through dust and weather, the men he had worked with, the particular solitude of the overnight watch. She told him about teaching, about the way children learned differently, and how she had discovered by accident that 2 of her students who were struggling to read were actually doing fine once she figured out that they needed to hear the words spoken aloud before they could connect them to the letters on the page. She had strong feelings about education and considerably stronger feelings about the lack of funding for schools in rural Texas, and she expressed these feelings clearly and at length. Hugh listened to all of it and found that he liked listening, which was not something he had known about himself with any precision before, because most of the people he talked to did not make him want to hear more. On the 3rd evening, they made camp near a dry creek bed, where a stand of cottonwoods provided some shelter from the wind, which had been kicking up from the north since midday and smelled of rain that had not arrived. Hugh built a fire and Sallie cooked, because she had specified on the first morning that she would cook if he did the horses and the camp setup, which he thought was a reasonable division and said so. She made a camp stew from dried beef and whatever she had in her supply bag, and it was considerably better than anything he had made himself in 10 days on the road, and he said so, and she looked pleased in the careful way of someone who does not want to be seen looking pleased. They ate by the fire, and the wind moved through the cottonwoods above them in long sighing waves. The stars were coming out, enormous and indifferent and beautiful in the Texas dark. "Can I ask you something?" Sallie said. "You don't need to ask permission," Hugh said. She looked at him across the fire. "What do you think is in New Mexico? What do you think the complications are?" He had been thinking about this since San Antonio. "I think," he said carefully, "that if it were simple, Mr. Hale would have sent a letter instead of a person. I think the complication is probably about the ranch itself, about either who else wants it or about something that happened there. A man builds something up over 15 years and then dies suddenly, and the thing goes to a daughter nobody knew about, who is 3 states away. That's the kind of situation that tends to have people in it who have opinions." Sallie was quiet for a moment. "Cole Briggs," she said, "the ranch manager." "Possibly," Hugh said. "Could be Briggs, could be someone else entirely, could be a debt or a dispute over the land itself or a neighbor who had expectations." "You think it might be dangerous," she said, not accusing, just locating the thing. "I think we should be careful," he said, "and ask a lot of questions before we do anything else." She smiled at that. It was the first full smile he had seen from her, and it changed her face considerably, opening it up, making it younger and warmer, and he felt the smile land somewhere in his chest in a way that he noted and did not examine too closely. "You do like asking questions," she said. "I have found," he said, "that the people who tell you not to ask questions are almost always the people who benefit from you not knowing the answers." Sallie looked at the fire for a long moment. "He wrote me a letter," she said. "My father, in the documents." Hugh waited. "He said he was sorry," she said. "He said he had spent 15 years trying to build something worth being sorry about, and that he hoped I would not despise the thing he had made just because he had made it poorly. He said he hoped I was like my mother, and then he said he hoped I was a little like him too, the part of him that always wanted to know what was over the next hill." paused. He said he asked about me sometimes. He never wrote because he thought I would not want him to. She stopped. Hugh did not say anything because some things don't require a response. I think, she said very quietly, that I am angry at him. I think I will be angry at him for a while, but I am going to his ranch anyway. That seems right, Hugh said. She nodded once and looked back up at the stars. They crossed into the New Mexico territory 8 days after leaving Dusty Creek. The land changed again at the border, becoming more dramatic. Mesa country with red and yellow rock formations rising from the flat plain like monuments to something enormous and indifferent. The light was different too, drier and harder, and the dust when the wind moved was white instead of the red Texas dust Hugh was used to. Sallie had never been to New Mexico, and she did not pretend otherwise. She looked at everything. She looked at the rock formations and the scrub juniper and the hawks that rode the thermals above the mesas, and she had questions about all of it. And Hugh answered what he could, and said he didn't know when he didn't know, and they both looked it up when there was no one to ask. She had brought 3 books in one of her canvas bags, which he had noticed on the first day with approval, and one of them was a natural history of the southwestern territories that she consulted periodically with the seriousness of a student preparing for an examination. On the second day in the territory, they stopped at a trading post at the edge of a small settlement to water the horses and buy supplies. The man running the trading post was named Eli, a weather-beaten man of around 50 with a long beard and the unhurried demeanor of someone who had nothing to prove to the passing world. Hugh bought tobacco he did not need as a social gesture and asked about the Morgan ranch. Eli's expression did not change much, but his eyes did. Morgan Ranch, he said. That would be the Double M about 15 miles south and east. You headed there? We are, Hugh said. This is Miss Sallie Morgan, Robert Morgan's daughter. Eli looked at Sallie with a new quality of attention. Robert Morgan's daughter, he said. Yes, sir, Sallie said. He talked about you, Eli said, and the weight in his voice was unexpected enough that Sallie went still. Not constantly, but sometimes when he'd been here a while and the whiskey had been poured. He talked about a little girl with dark hair in a town in Texas. He paused. I'm sorry for your loss, miss. Thank you, Sallie said, in a voice that was doing a lot of careful work. Can I ask, Hugh said, what you know about the current state of things at the Double M? I've heard there may be some complications regarding the property. Eli looked at him. Then he looked at the door as if checking who might be near it. Then he refilled their glasses from a ceramic jug and settled both forearms on the counter. Cole Briggs, he said. I thought it might be, Hugh said. Cole Briggs has been running the Double M for 5 years, Eli said. He was good at it, I'll give him that. Robert did not choose poorly on that front. But Briggs had it in his head, from what I have heard from men who work the ranch, that when Robert died the property would become his. Not by inheritance, not by any legal document, just by the fact of his having run it. He was apparently surprised to hear that Robert had a daughter and that she was getting the Double M. How surprised, Hugh said. The kind of surprised, Eli said, that makes a man loud and unpleasant at a bar. Sallie set down her glass. He intends to contest it. He intends to make it difficult, Eli said. Whether he has any legal ground to stand on, that I cannot say. But he has 5 men who work for him, and he has been the authority at the Double M for 5 years, and he is, in my opinion, the kind of man who confuses having been in charge with having a right to be in charge. He paused. Your father was liked. The older hands, the men who came with Robert from the beginning, they won't side with Briggs. But Briggs has brought his own people in over the past couple years, and they are loyal to him. Hugh looked at Sallie. She was sitting very straight and her hands were around her glass and she was thinking hard. How many of my father's original men, she said. 3 or 4 who are still there, Eli said. There is a man called Shepard, Pete Shepard, who came out with your father in '67 and has been at the Double M ever since. He is solid. And there is a woman, a Mexican woman named Rosa, who cooks and manages the house. She adored your father and she will not welcome Briggs's authority. She has made that clear from what I understand. Hugh said. And you, Mr. Eli, you don't have a stake in this one way or another. Eli smiled, the first time his expression had shifted significantly. "I have a trading post," he said. "I have a stake in every dispute in this territory resolving without gunfire, because gunfire is bad for commerce. That is the extent of my stake." "We appreciate the information," Hugh said. They rode the 15 miles south and east with a new quality of silence between them. Not uncomfortable, but working. The land around the Double M was good land. Hugh could see that immediately, mesa to the north and west providing some wind shelter, good grass in the low places where the water ran, a creek that was still holding water despite the dry spring. The house when they reached it was larger than Hugh had expected, a main house of whitewashed adobe with a proper porch and glass windows, a bunkhouse to one side, a large barn, a series of corrals with cattle in them and horses in another. It was a real ranch, a working ranch, the kind of thing a man spends 15 years building and is right to be proud of. A man was standing on the porch watching them ride in through the gate. He was around 40, broad and solid, with a flat wind-burned face and pale eyes that were doing a calculation behind them. He wore a good hat and a good belt, and the easy stance of a man who considers himself on his own ground. Cole Briggs. Hugh read him in about 4 seconds and disliked most of what he read. Briggs came down off the porch as they reined in. He looked at Hugh first assessingly and then at Sallie, and something moved in his expression that was not exactly hostile but was not welcoming either. It was the expression of a man managing his response. "You'll be the Morgan girl," he said. Sallie looked at him from the saddle and did not move to dismount. "I am Sallie Morgan," she said, "and you are Mr. Briggs." "Cole Briggs," he said. "I've been running this property for 5 years." "I know," she said. "I've been informed of that." "I appreciate the work you've put in here." Something flickered in Briggs's eyes. He had expected, Hugh thought, either more deference or more aggression, and Sallie had given him neither, which was leaving him without a prepared response. Hugh appreciated her for it. "We'll need to have a conversation about how things are run here," Briggs said. "There are arrangements that have been in place for some time." "We will have that conversation," Sallie said. "Tomorrow, when I have had time to settle in and look at the property. Mr. Easton is with me. He will be assisting me in managing the transition." She looked at him with those level eyes. "Tonight, I would like to see my father's house." Briggs looked at Hugh with an expression Hugh had seen before on men who resented the presence of another man without having immediate cause to object to it. Then he looked back at Sallie, and something in his calculation shifted slightly. "House is yours," he said. "Rosa will show you around." Rosa appeared in the doorway of the main house as if she had been waiting, which she probably had been. She was a small, compact woman of around 50 with gray-streaked hair and black eyes that were currently doing an extremely thorough assessment of both of them. When she had finished, she came down the steps and took Sallie's hands in both of hers and looked up at her. "You have his eyes," she said. "I am Rosa Garza. I cooked for your father for 11 years, and I will cook for you too, if you will have me." Sallie looked at this woman who had known her father and seemed to absorb something from her hands. "Thank you, Rosa," she said. "I am very glad to meet you." Hugh saw Briggs watching this exchange with the particular expression of a man who is noting which way the wind is blowing. The inside of the main house was full of Robert Morgan, which was to say it was full of a man Sallie had not known as an adult, a man who had turned out, on the evidence, to have been organized and hardworking, and to have had, of all things, a substantial personal library. There were books on shelves along the whole of one wall in the main room, not decorative books but working books, histories and cattle manuals and maps, and 2 well-worn volumes of poetry that surprised Hugh when he noticed them. There were maps pinned to the walls with notes in a small cramped hand. There was a desk with an inkwell and a blotter and a ledger book that was thick with 15 years of careful accounting. Sallie moved through the room slowly, touching things, not speaking much. Hugh followed at a respectful distance and watched her encounter the life of a man she had lost twice, once when she was 11 and he left, and again 6 weeks ago when he died without her knowing him. In the bedroom, there was a small framed photograph on the nightstand. It was of a woman and a child, the woman standing, the child sitting in front of her, and even in the poor quality of the photograph the resemblance was clear. The woman was Clara Morgan. The child was Sallie, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with dark hair and eyes that looked directly into the camera with an expression of absolute seriousness that was, Hugh thought, identical to the expression Sallie wore when she was thinking hard about something. Sallie picked up the photograph and held it for a long time. Hugh very quietly left the room and went to see about the horses. He found Pete Shepherd in the barn, a wiry man in his late 40s with a gray beard and the slightly bowed legs of a man who had spent his adult life on horses. Shepherd looked at Hugh with the frank appraising look of a man who has spent years reading strangers and acted accordingly. "You with the Morgan girl?" Shepherd said. "I came with Miss Morgan from Texas." "Yes," Hugh said. "She really Robert's daughter?" "She is," Hugh said. "I have seen the documents and I believe the lawyer in San Antonio has done his due diligence." Shepherd nodded slowly. "Then the double M is hers," he said. "Robert talked about her, said he made a bad mistake leaving, said he was trying to make it right." He paused. "He wasn't a bad man, Robert. He was a man who couldn't stay still, and who let his inability to stay still become someone else's problem, which is a different thing than being bad but isn't good either." "What's the situation with Briggs?" Hugh said. Shepherd was quiet for a moment, pulling a brush through a horse's flank in long, even strokes. "Briggs is a capable man," he said. "He's run this place well enough. He's also a man who has been telling himself for 2 years since Robert got sick that this place would be his. He's not going to hand it over easy." "Does he have any legal claim to it?" "None," Shepherd said flatly. "Robert was clear about that in his will from what the lawyer said in the letter that came out here. Briggs knows it. But knowing you have no legal claim and accepting it are two different things when you've been somewhere 5 years and built something with your own hands." Hugh nodded. "How many of the hands are Briggs's men?" "4 that I would call his, 2 that could go either way," Shepherd said. "Me and Jimmy Cord and old Davies are Robert's people, Miss Morgan's people now, and Rosa." He paused again. "And Briggs will not touch Rosa because her brother is Antonio Garza, who runs the largest cattle operation in this part of the territory and who has 3 sons. Briggs is many things, but he is not stupid." Hugh filed this information carefully. "Thank you, Mr. Shepherd." "Don't let her be pushed around," Shepherd said. "It was not a request exactly. It was the statement of a man communicating a priority. Robert would not want her pushed around." "She doesn't strike me as the type to be pushed around," Hugh said. For the first time, Shepherd smiled. "No," he said. "She doesn't, does she?" The first week at the Double M was the most complicated week Hugh had experienced in some years, which was saying something given that he had once been hired to track down a man who turned out to have 3 separate identities and 2 active wives in different counties. The ranch, the actual ranch, the cattle and the land and the accounts, was in good shape. Sallie went through the ledger book with Hugh every evening, and it was clear that her father had been meticulous and that Briggs had maintained that meticulousness, and the Double M was genuinely profitable for a ranch its size. There were around 800 head of cattle, a working horse operation of modest size, and a contract with a buyer in Santa Fe that was worth real money if maintained. Sallie was good at the numbers. She had been keeping the school's accounts for 3 years, and she had a clear head for figures and an instinct for where things didn't add up. She found on the 4th evening a discrepancy in the accounts from the past 18 months, a small but consistent difference between what was recorded as cattle sold and what the buyer's receipts showed had been paid, and she brought this to Hugh and showed him the figures spread out on the desk under the lamp. Hugh looked at the numbers for a long time. "That's $500 roughly," he said. "Over 18 months," she said. "In small amounts, small enough to miss if you weren't looking carefully." "Did Briggs do the accounts?" "He did for the last 2 years," she said. "My father did them before." Hugh sat back. "Don't bring this to Briggs yet," he said. "We need to understand the full picture before we confront him with anything." "I agree," she said. She was sitting across the desk from him in the lamplight, her books and papers spread between them, and she looked, he thought, more settled than she had when she arrived. The house was becoming more familiar to her. He could see it happening gradually, the way she moved through the rooms with less deliberateness and more ease. She had taken down the heavy curtains in the main room, which had been dark and oppressive, and the April light came in now in the mornings and made the room entirely different. "I want to ride the property tomorrow," she said. "All of it. I want to see what I have." "I'll come with you," he said. She looked at him with those brown eyes and said, "Hugh." It was the first time she had used his first name, and it was so natural that he almost missed it, except that he did not miss it at all. "Yes," he said. "Why are you still here?" she said, not unkindly, genuinely asking in the way she genuinely asked everything. "You've done what you were hired to do. You brought me the letter, you came out here, you've helped me understand the situation. Mr. Hale is not paying you for this." Hugh thought about how to answer this and decided that the honest answer was the only one worth giving. "I'm not sure I can leave a situation half understood," he said. "It's a character failing, my mother always said. I have to know how it ends." Sallie looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her deciding something. "That's not entirely true," she said softly. "No," he said, "it's not entirely true." She looked down at the ledger pages and then back up at him. "I'm glad you're here," she said. The night was very quiet around the lamp. They rode the property the next day, all 800 acres of it, with Pete Shepard as guide. Shepard knew every corner of the Double M, with the intimacy of a man who had built fences in it, and moved cattle across it in rain and drought and heat. He pointed out the good water sources, the places where the grass was best, the pastures where Robert Morgan had made improvements. He showed them the property boundary, which in 2 places was marked by stone cairns that Robert had built himself, and in 1 place was marked by a cedar post with Robert Morgan's initials carved into it and the date 1869. Sallie stood at that post for a long time. "He carved that in '69, she said. "I was 6. "Yes, ma'am," Shepard said quietly. She looked out across the land, which was wide and clear in the morning light, the grass beginning to show green in the low draws, and the mountains to the west going purple and blue in the distance. "He did good work here," she said, and there was something in her voice that was grief and anger and a reluctant respect all in the same breath. Hugh stayed back and let her have the moment. On their way back to the main house, they crossed paths with 3 of Briggs's men moving a small group of cattle toward a northern pasture. The men stopped and looked at Sallie in the way that men look at a woman they have decided to assess rather than accommodate, and Hugh pulled his horse slightly forward, not threateningly, just enough to be present and visible, and the men moved their cattle on without comment. Sallie noticed. She said nothing about it until later when they were back at the house and Shepard had gone to the barn. Then she said, "You positioned yourself between me and those men." "I noticed that," Hugh said. "I didn't need you to do that," she said, but her voice was not sharp, it was considering. "No," he said, "you probably didn't, but I did it anyway. I'll try to do it less if you prefer." She looked at him for a moment and then said, "No, don't do it less. Just know that I noticed, and that I don't take it for granted." The confrontation with Cole Briggs came on the 9th day, and it came at Hugh's initiative, which was to say he asked for a meeting rather than waiting for Briggs to call one. He had found that waiting for situations to develop was almost always inferior to walking into them with your own questions, and this situation had been simmering long enough. They sat at the table in the main house, Briggs and Hugh and Sallie, with Rosa conspicuously present in the kitchen, and making no pretense of not listening. Briggs sat with his arms crossed and his flat eyes moving between the 2 of them, and Hugh laid the account discrepancy on the table. Briggs was silent for a moment that was too long to be comfortable. Then he said, "Those accounts are correct." "They are not," Sallie said. "I have the buyer's receipts and the ledger records, and they do not match. The difference is $487 over 18 months. Briggs looked at her. He had not, Hugh suspected, expected her to be the one who said it. "You are new here," Briggs said. "You don't understand how the accounting is done." I understand numbers, Sallie said, and I understand that $487 is $487 regardless of how the accounting is done. That money went to operational expenses, Briggs said, and the words came a fraction too quickly. Show me the receipts, Sallie said. Briggs went very still. I don't answer to you, he said, and his voice had changed, the civility drained out of it. I built this operation. I ran it for 5 years while Robert Morgan was dying by degrees in that room, and I kept it going when any other man would have taken what he could and moved on. You have been here 9 days. You don't know this land, and you don't know these cattle, and you don't know the first thing about what it takes to hold a place like this together. Hugh said, quietly, That's all true. Miss Morgan doesn't contest any of that. Briggs looked at him. She is also the legal owner of this property as of her father's death, Hugh said. And there is a discrepancy in the accounts that you are the manager responsible for. Those two things can both be true at the same time. Show us the receipts for the operational expenses, or we will need to have a different conversation. The silence in the room was the kind of silence that contains several different possible futures. Hugh was aware of Rosa in the kitchen having gone completely quiet. He was aware of the sound of the wind against the window. He was aware of Sallie sitting to his left, absolutely still, absolutely steady. Briggs made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a scoff. I don't have receipts for every small expense, he said. Then you owe the estate $487, Sallie said, which will be deducted from your wages on settlement. She paused. Which will occur at the end of this month, at which time we will also discuss whether you wish to remain on as a hand, at a hand's wages and under my management, or whether you would prefer to take your settlement and go. Briggs stared at her. I am not trying to push you out, Sallie said, and her voice was entirely even. You know this land and I do not. I would benefit from your knowledge. But I am not going to pretend that $487 did not go missing, and I am not going to manage this property as though it is not mine, because it is mine, and I intend to take care of it. Briggs stood up. He was, Hugh thought, a man making a decision that would define a great deal about the next chapter of his life, and he was not a stupid man, and he could read the situation clearly enough. He looked at Sallie for a long moment. End of the month, he said. End of the month, she said. He left the house, and the door was not quite slammed, but it was closed with more energy than necessary. Rosa appeared in the kitchen doorway. Good, she said simply, and went back to the stove. Sallie let out a long breath, very slowly, the way a person does when they have been holding themselves very carefully and can now stop. Hugh looked at her and she looked back at him, and something moved between them that had been building for a while and that neither of them had named yet. That was very well done, he said. My hands are shaking, she said. That's fine, he said. Your voice wasn't. She looked at her hands and then she laughed, a real laugh surprised out of her, and it was the best sound he had heard in a long time. Cole Briggs left the double M at the end of the month, which surprised Hugh somewhat, because he had expected resistance or delay or some attempt at maneuvering. But Briggs took his settlement with the missing $487 deducted, said a minimal goodbye to the men who had worked for him, and rode north. Pete Shepard, who had watched the whole of the man's tenure with the long patience of someone who knew things would eventually sort themselves out, said only that Briggs had known, somewhere in himself, that it was over. 2 of the hands who had been Briggs's men left with him. 2 stayed, saying that they had no particular loyalty to Briggs specifically, and a great deal of loyalty to the wages and the quality of the land. The double M settled into a new shape, not without difficulty, because it is never easy to reorganize a working operation, and Sallie had to learn everything at once. The cattle management and the schedules and the relationships with buyers and the endless practical arithmetic of keeping 800 head of cattle alive and profitable on the high desert range. Hugh taught her what he knew, which was substantial, and Pete Shepard taught her what Hugh didn't know, and Rosa taught her the domestic economy of the house and the particular rhythms of a ranch that outsiders never understand. She was a remarkable student. Hugh had known this from the road, from the way she consumed the natural history book and asked questions about everything she saw. But here, applied to something concrete and immediate and hers, she was formidable. She was not too proud to ask the same question twice, and she remembered everything she was told, and she applied it correctly, and she worked as hard as any person Hugh had watched work in his life, which was saying something because he had worked cattle drives. He watched her become someone who belonged to this land. It happened in increments, the same way she had gradually moved through the rooms of the house with less and less hesitation, until one morning in the 6th week, he looked up from the corral fence he was mending to see her coming back from the eastern pasture on Patience, her hat pushed back on her head, and her hair coming down in the familiar way it always did by midday, and she was laughing at something Pete Shepherd had said, and she was entirely, unmistakably at home. He did not realize he had stopped working and was just watching her until she came through the gate and caught him at it. She stopped her horse. She looked at him with those direct brown eyes and a smile that was warm and knowing. "You are not fixing the fence," she said. "I am thinking about fixing the fence," he said. She laughed and went on toward the barn, and he stood there for a moment with a hammer in his hand and the very clear understanding that he was entirely in love with Sallie Morgan, and that this was not a surprise so much as a recognition, the way you recognize a place you have never been because someone has described it to you so well. He went back to the fence and thought about it while he worked. The telling of it did not happen quickly or easily, because they were both people who thought carefully about what they said, and because the situation between them was one in which it was not entirely clear where the professional ended and the personal began. And Hugh was aware that he had come here on her behalf and lived in her father's house and eaten at her table, and he did not want to be a person who mistook proximity for permission. But the territory had its own opinions. It was late June, 3 months after their arrival, and the evenings were long and warm, and they had developed the habit of sitting on the porch after dinner, the way people do when the days have been hard, and the night is the first time the air is not an obstacle. Rosa had gone to bed, and the ranch was quiet, and the stars had come out in their New Mexico extravagance. Sallie was sitting in the chair she had taken as her own, a rocking chair that had been her father's but that she had claimed without quite acknowledging she was claiming it. And she was not rocking, just sitting, and she was looking at the mountains that were dark shapes against the darker sky. "I have been writing letters to the school board in Dusty Creek," she said, "about finding a permanent teacher." Hugh looked at her. "Not going back." "No," she said, "not going back." She paused. "I was going to ask you what you thought about that." "I think it makes sense," he said. "This place needs you." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know what this place needs. I'm still learning it." She turned slightly in her chair to look at him. "What do you need?" He met her eyes. In the lamplight from the doorway, her face was clear and warm, and her eyes were direct as they always were, asking the question she was actually asking, not a version of it, not a polite substitute for it. "I need," he said carefully, "to ask you a question, and I want to know before I ask it that whatever the answer is, I will respect it and nothing between us will change." She turned her body toward him in the chair. She was very still. "I need to know," he said, "whether what I feel when I look at you, which is something I have been feeling since a morning in a kitchen in Dusty Creek when you told me you had $2 in a tin under the bed, whether that is something you feel too. Because I am not going to assume it, I am going to ask." Sallie Morgan looked at him for a long moment. The night was very quiet. A coyote somewhere far off called once and went silent. "It is something I feel too," she said. "It has been for some time." He let out a breath. "I was waiting for you to ask," she said, and the edge of a smile was in her voice. "I knew you would ask eventually. You ask everything." "I do," he said. "Come here," she said. He moved his chair close to hers, and they sat like that, close enough that their arms were touching, and looked out at the dark mountains and the enormous sky. And after a while, her hand found his on the armrest, and he turned it over, and their fingers folded together and held. It was the best question he had ever asked. The summer was the best Hugh had ever spent. He had not known before what it meant to have somewhere to be and someone to be there with, and work that was real and land that was worth something. And the combination of all of these things settling into place around him was like something he had not known to want until he was inside of it. He and Sallie worked the ranch together through the summer, and as the weeks passed, the professional and personal wound so thoroughly together that they were no longer distinguishable, which Hugh found to be the best possible outcome, because it meant that she was entirely herself with him all the time and he with her, and there was no version of the day when they were not simply, fully present with each other. He kissed her for the first time in the barn on an evening in July, when they had been working late on a problem with one of the horse stalls, and she had said something funny and he had laughed, and she was looking at him with that expression she got sometimes, warm and open and a little vulnerable, and he had taken her face in both hands and she had lifted her face to him, and it was, he thought, exactly right. She kissed him back with her hands fisted in his shirt and then leaned her forehead against his chin and said, "It took you long enough." "I was being careful," he said. "You," she said, "are never careful." "I was careful about this," he said. She looked up at him with those brown eyes and smiled the full smile, the one that changed her face. "Then I am glad of your care," she said. Rosa knew the next morning, which Hugh could tell from the particular quality of her satisfaction at breakfast. She said nothing until he caught her eye over the coffee pot, and she simply nodded once with an expression of complete approval. He suspected she had known before they did. Pete Shepherd, when Hugh told him, shook his hand without ceremony and said, "Good." "That's good," which was, from Shepherd, approximately equivalent to a formal speech. August brought a cattle drive, a smaller one than the Kishom Trail runs Hugh had done in his 20s, but a real one, moving 120 head to the buyer in Santa Fe, along the route that Robert Morgan had used for years. Sallie went on the drive, which caused a quiet internal conversation among the hands that Hugh did not insert himself into but watched with interest. And after the first day, everyone had settled into the understanding that the woman riding Point knew what she was doing, and said what she meant and worked as hard as anyone, and the quiet conversation was over. On the second night of the drive, camped along a creek in the mountain foothills, Hugh built a fire and Sallie cooked, the way they had done on the road from Dusty Creek, which seemed now like a very long time ago and simultaneously like the beginning of a thing that was still going. "I keep thinking about my father on this road," Sallie said. She was stirring the pot and looking into it, but he could tell she was seeing something else. "He drove cattle along this exact route, probably dozens of times." "He did," Hugh said. "He was sitting on a bedroll nearby, close enough to talk. Shepherd said he loved this part, the drives." "I think I understand that," she said, and her voice was quiet and considered. "There is something about it, the working cattle, the size of it. You feel small in a good way. Like the sky in West Texas," he said. She looked over at him and smiled. "Yes, exactly like that." They rode into Santa Fe 2 days later, trail dusty and tired and in excellent spirits. The buyer, a man named Harmon who ran a substantial distribution operation, met them at his pens and walked the cattle with Sallie, making his assessment in the way of a man who has been buying cattle for 20 years and knows exactly what he is looking at. He offered a fair price, a little under what Hugh might have pushed for, and Hugh glanced at Sallie and saw in her expression that she had already done the calculation and was about to negotiate. She did negotiate, calmly and with specific reference to the weight and condition of the animals and the current market rate in Santa Fe, and Harmon looked at her with the expression of a man reassessing, and then, without any drama, agreed to the figure she proposed. He shook her hand. Hugh watched this and felt a specific kind of pride that he recognized was probably absurd, but was entirely genuine. Santa Fe was the biggest city either of them had been near in months, and after the sale was concluded and the men were settled at a boarding house, Sallie put on her good dress, the deep blue one she had brought from Texas, and they had dinner at a proper restaurant with tablecloths and candles, which felt, After months of camp food and kitchen tables, absolutely extraordinary. She laughed at how formally she and Hugh sat down, both of them slightly too aware of the quality of the setting. "We are going to eat too much," she said. "I am counting on it," he said. The food was very good and the wine was decent, and they talked about the drive and the cattle and Rosa's plan to plant a more substantial kitchen garden next spring. And then, gradually, they talked about other things, and the candles burned down, and the restaurant emptied around them without either of them fully noticing. "I want to do something for the school," Sallie said over the last of the wine. "Not in Dusty Creek, I mean here, in the territory. I have been thinking about it. There are settlements around the Double M where children have no access to any school. I want to do something about that." "What kind of something?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said. "A traveling teacher, maybe. Someone who goes from settlement to settlement, or help fund a proper schoolhouse somewhere central. The ranch is profitable enough." She paused. "My father spent 15 years building this land. I want to do something with it that reaches further than cattle." He looked at her across the table. She was serious about everything, this woman. She thought about the world beyond her own edges constantly, and when she thought about it, she looked for something she could do, not something she could lament. "That's a good thing to do," he said. "You could help me figure out how to do it," she said. "You surveyed land. You know the territory. You know how to find things out." "I could," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I mean you could stay," she said. "Permanently, I mean that is what I am asking." He held her gaze. The candle between them had burned to a stub and was throwing its light upward, and it made her face warm and clear and entirely known to him. "Ask me properly," he said. She laughed very quietly. "Hugh Easton," she said, "will you stay?" "Yes," he said, "but I want something more than staying." She tilted her head slightly. "I want to marry you," he said, "if you'll have me." Sallie Morgan looked at him for a moment that was long and full, and he watched her eyes move through several things and come to rest. "I have been hoping," she said, "that you would ask that." "I ask everything," he said. "You do," she said, "and I am so glad of it." They married in October of 1878 on the porch of the Double M at sunset, with Pete Shepard and Rosa and the hands gathered, and a minister who had ridden out from the nearest town, and the mountains going red and gold behind them in the autumn light. Sallie wore a dress that Rosa had helped her make, white cotton with blue embroidery at the collar and cuffs, and she wore her hair partly down, the way Hugh had said he preferred, and she carried a small bunch of dried wildflowers from the high pasture that Shepard had thought to collect. Hugh wore his cleanest shirt and his good jacket, and felt that if he was any happier he would likely not be able to stand up properly. The ceremony was short, because the minister was a practical man, and the evening was cooling, but the words had the quality of things that mean exactly what they say when the people saying them intend them completely, and Hugh held Sallie's hands and looked at her in the last light, and felt the whole of the preceding year arrange itself into a shape that was exactly right. "I do," she said, and her voice was clear and steady. "I do," he said. Rosa cried and made no pretense of not crying. Shepard shook Hugh's hand so hard it was nearly painful. One of the younger hands played a fiddle, somewhat imperfectly but with great enthusiasm, and they danced on the porch until the stars came out. In November, Sallie wrote a long letter to the territorial school board in Santa Fe, proposing a plan for a traveling teacher to serve the settlements within a 30-mile radius of Dusty Creek and Santa Rosa. She included a financial commitment from the Double M to cover the teacher's salary for 2 years, after which she proposed the territorial board should take over the funding. She had Hugh review it before she sent it, and he suggested 3 changes, 2 of which she accepted, and 1 of which she argued about so convincingly that he conceded she was right. The school board wrote back in January agreeing to the proposal and asking to meet. In February, 2 things happened. The school board meeting in Santa Fe went well, and a contract was signed for the traveling school, which Sallie had taken to calling in her own notes the circuit school, like a circuit preacher, the teaching going where the children were. And Rosa, who missed nothing, told Hugh privately in the kitchen that he ought to be aware that Sallie was not eating breakfast with her usual appetite, and that this was probably something he should pay attention to, and then gave him a look that communicated everything else. Hugh was, not for the first time in his life, absolutely delighted by the answer to a question he had been wondering about. He found Sallie in the barn that afternoon, where she was checking on a mare who had been off her feed, and he stood in the doorway and said, "Are you going to tell me?" She turned around. She looked at him with her direct brown eyes, and then she smiled slowly, the full smile. "I was going to tell you tonight," she said. "Rosa told me this morning," he said. Sallie closed her eyes briefly. "Of course she did," she opened them. "I am very early along. I don't want to say too much yet." He crossed the barn to where she was standing and took her hands, and she looked up at him, and the smile was still there, softer now. "I am allowed to be happy about it," he said. "You are very allowed," she said. He put his arms around her, carefully, and she leaned into him and was quiet for a moment. And outside the barn the February sun was making a tentative and optimistic appearance from behind the cloud cover it had maintained all morning. "I am afraid," she said quietly into his shoulder. "Of course you are," he said. "That's reasonable. Are you mostly afraid or mostly happy?" She considered this genuinely. "Mostly happy," she said, "but also afraid." "That seems exactly right," he said. The spring of 1879 was the best spring the Double M had seen in several years, or so Shepard said, and he was the authority. The grass came up early and strong. The herd had been well managed through the winter, and the calves came healthy. The creek ran full. Sallie, who was visibly expecting by April, and had not slowed down in any measurable degree, much to Rosa's vocally expressed concern, supervised the planting of an expanded kitchen garden, and corresponded regularly with the circuit school teacher, a young woman named Agnes Clark, who had come out from Missouri with an education and a cheerful willingness to ride long distances for the sake of her students. Agnes Clark visited the Double M in April and spent 3 days, and she and Sallie sat at the dining table for hours discussing curriculum and the particular challenges of teaching in settlements where school was not a cultural expectation, and parents often had work for their children that competed with lessons. Hugh made coffee and listened, and occasionally said something useful, and mostly found the conversation among the most interesting he had heard in a long time. "You should come and see one of the sessions," Agnes said to Sallie on the last evening. "In Tierra Roja, the settlement east of here, the children there have taken to it remarkably well." "I will," Sallie said. "In the fall." Hugh said, "In the fall she will have rather a lot going on." Agnes looked at him and then at Sallie and understood, and congratulated them both with a warmth that was entirely genuine. The baby came in late July, in the heat of the summer, and it was a boy, which Hugh had not specifically hoped for but was enormously happy about. He was born in the main house of the Double M with Rosa in attendance and a midwife who had come from the settlement at Santa Rosa. And the labor was hard and long, and Hugh spent a significant portion of it standing outside the bedroom door in a state of controlled terror that he expressed by asking Rosa questions every time she came out, until she told him firmly to either make himself useful by boiling more water or go sit on the porch and be quiet. He boiled the water and was neither quiet nor still, but he was present and ready, and when Rosa finally opened the door and told him to come in, and he came in and found Sallie exhausted and pale and entirely alive, and holding a small red angry person who was objecting loudly to everything about the world, Hugh sat down on the edge of the bed and took her hand and kissed her forehead and looked at the child she was holding. "He's extraordinary," he said, because it was true. "He looks like a small, furious stranger," she said hoarsely, and then immediately looked guilty. "I do not mean that as a criticism." "He does look a bit furious," Hugh agreed. "He will settle," Rosa said from the doorway. They named him Robert James Easton, Robert for her father and James for Hugh's, and they called him by both names without shortening either, which Rosa said was a mouthful, and Shepard said approvingly that a boy needed a name with some weight to it. and Hugh said that they had simply agreed, and Sallie said it was her name to choose and she chose it, which ended the conversation. By the time Robert James was 3 months old, the ranch had found a new rhythm that incorporated him without interrupting much, because Sallie managed it, and because Rosa adored him and was perfectly happy to be his caretaker while Sallie worked, and because the boy was, as Rosa had predicted, much less furious once he had gotten a few weeks into the project of existing. In the autumn, Sallie went to Tierra Roja to see Agnes Clark's circuit school session, riding out with Hugh on a clear October morning. The session was held in the largest room of a farmhouse, with 12 children packed in ranging in age from about 6 to 13, and Agnes teaching with the particular energetic patience of a good teacher, and Sallie sat in the back of the room and watched with an expression that Hugh recognized as the face of someone seeing something they had imagined actually working. On the road back, she rode beside him and was quiet for a while in the productive way. "We need more teachers," she said. "We need 3 more sections at minimum to cover the settlements within reasonable distance." "That's a lot of salary," he said. "The ranch can cover the first year," she said. "After that I need the territorial board to commit properly. I am going to go to Santa Fe and make that case in person." "I'll come with you," he said. "You always say that," she said. "I always mean it," he said. She looked at him sidelong. "You do," she said. "You always mean it." They went to Santa Fe in November, leaving Robert James with Rosa and a slightly more anxious shepherd, who had never specifically been responsible for a baby before, but rose to the occasion with the competence he brought to everything else. The meeting with the Territorial School Board took 2 days and produced a commitment for 2 additional teaching positions and a territorial subsidy for school supplies in rural settlements, which was not everything Sallie had asked for but was significantly more than existed before she walked in the door. On the night before they rode home, they had dinner again at the same restaurant where Hugh had proposed, which felt like a necessary and meaningful thing to do. The tablecloths were the same or similar enough, and the candles were shorter because Sallie had been right about eating too much and they had been there a while. "Look where we are," she said at one point. "The restaurant." "From where we started," she said. "You rode into my yard with an envelope you knew nothing about and 1,000 questions you wouldn't stop asking, and now—" She gestured with her wine glass at the general concept of everything, the ranch and the child and the school and the life. "To be fair," he said, "the questions were the whole thing. If I hadn't asked, none of this would have happened." "You were told not to ask," she reminded him. "I was told a great many things I didn't do," he said. She laughed. She was wearing the blue dress again and her hair was up and she looked like herself, which was his favorite thing about her, that she always, entirely looked like herself. "Thank you for asking," she said. "Everything you asked." "Thank you for answering," he said. "Not everyone does." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "I will always answer your questions," she said, "even the ones that are inconvenient." "Especially those," he said. "Yes," she said, "especially those." The years that followed were full in the way that good lives are full, not just with events but with the texture of days, the particular color of the light on the mountain in different seasons, the smell of rain on hot ground in July, the sound of cattle in the early morning when the world was still cool. Robert James grew up with the ranch as his first language, knowing the names of every pasture and the character of every horse and the history of every fence line, which Pete Shepherd taught him with the same patience and thoroughness he had brought to teaching his parents. He was a serious child with his mother's eyes and his father's habit of asking questions, which everyone found slightly exhausting and entirely endearing. Sallie's circuit school grew. By 1882, there were 5 teachers serving 17 settlements in the territory, funded jointly by the Double M and the Territorial Board, and Sallie corresponded with every one of them and visited as many as she could manage and had become, without quite intending to, something of an authority on rural education in the Southwest. Agnes Clark, who had become a genuine friend, said that Sallie had done more for education in the territory in 3 years than the board had managed in a decade, which Sallie received with the particular discomfort of someone who does not know what to do with praise and therefore makes a joke. Hugh did the land surveying for 2 expansion projects on the Double M, work he had always loved, and that felt different now, that it was his own land he was measuring, his and Sallie's and Robert James's and whoever else came along. He also, with Shepard's blessing and guidance, took over more of the day-to-day cattle management, which was the continuation of a process that had been happening gradually since their first year, and the ranch under their joint management ran better than it had under anyone else's, though he credited much of this to Rosa and Shepard, who between them had 70 years of knowledge of this particular land. The second child, a girl they named Clara for Sallie's mother, was born in 1883 when Robert James was 4. She arrived with considerably less drama than her brother, which Rosa said was because everyone including Sallie herself knew more this time, and which Hugh suspected was also just the personality of Clara Easton, who was from the beginning a person who did things efficiently and without fuss. Robert James was uncertain about her for approximately 1 week, and then became fiercely devoted, which was a character trait he would maintain for the rest of his life. In the summer of 1884, Garrett Hale, the lawyer from San Antonio, wrote to Sallie about an additional inheritance, a small parcel of land her father had owned in Colorado that had taken some time to work through the courts. The letter was characteristically uninformative about the details. Sallie read it at the breakfast table and passed it across to Hugh with the expression of someone handing another person a familiar puzzle. Hugh read it. He looked up at her. "He says there may be some complications regarding the title. He always says that," she said. "I have a great many questions," Hugh said. Sallie smiled at him across the breakfast table, Robert James on one side with his breakfast and Clara on the other with hers, and Rosa at the stove and the September morning coming in through the window. She had never put the heavy curtains back on. "You always do," she said. "Should I write him?" Hugh said. "Write him," she said. "Ask everything." "I will," he said, and reached for the pen that lived on the end of the table because in their house there was always a question being written down somewhere, always something being tracked and examined and understood, and this was simply the way of it, the daily fact of 2 people who had found each other because one of them refused to stop asking and the other one had decided to answer. Outside, the ranch went about its morning. The cattle were moving in the north pasture, a slow drift of shapes in the early light. Shepard was visible through the window heading toward the barn with the unhurried, purposeful walk he had had every morning for 20 years. Somewhere on the road to the east, Agnes Clark was probably already on her horse heading toward Tierra Roja, carrying books and chalk, and the conviction that children in the territory had as much right to learn as children anywhere. Robert James asked why Hugh was writing a letter, and Hugh explained about the land in Colorado, and Robert James asked where Colorado was, and Hugh told him, and Robert James asked if they would go there, and Hugh said maybe, and Robert James asked why only maybe, and Sallie said from across the table that the answer to that would require going to get the big map, and that they should do that after breakfast. "Can I ask the questions?" Robert James said. "You always ask the questions," Hugh said. "I know," Robert James said, with the satisfaction of someone reporting a cherished fact about themselves. Hugh looked at Sallie. She was smiling at her coffee cup, not at him, but in the way she sometimes did when she was smiling at something that included him, the whole of it, the table and the children and the morning and the life. He felt it land the same place it had always landed, the same warm, specific place behind his ribs that had been hers since a morning in a spare kitchen in Texas when she had told him with complete honesty that she was terrified but ready. He was still asking questions. She was still answering them. The ranch was still running. The school was still teaching. The mountains to the west were still going blue and purple in the late afternoon light. And the life they had built in this place, from an envelope and a direction and the refusal to stop asking, was full and warm and entirely, unmistakably theirs. Pete Shepard fixed the broken fence post at the gate, the one that had been her father's unfixed business, in the autumn of 1885. Sallie found out about it on a ride back from the eastern pasture and stopped her horse and looked at the new post standing straight and solid in the ground, and she sat there for a moment with her hand on Patience's neck. She thought about her father, who had not fixed it and had not stayed, and had spent 15 years trying to make something worth the leaving. She thought about the photograph on the nightstand, the small, serious girl and the standing woman. She thought about the letter she had read that first day at this kitchen table, his handwriting apologizing across years. She had been angry at him for a long time. The anger had not gone away entirely, because some things do not go away. They just find their proper proportion in a life that is large enough to contain them. But sitting at the gate with the new post standing where the old broken one had been, she thought that he had loved her in his limited, unable way, and that he had left her this land, and that she had made something of it that was real and good and hers, and that this was, maybe, the best possible answer to all of it. She rode home through the golden afternoon to where Hugh was at the fence line in the near pasture, working with the easy competence he brought to everything, and he looked up as she came through the gate and she waved at him and he raised a hand back. And it was a small gesture, ordinary, the kind of thing you do 100 times in a life, and it was everything. She put her horse up and went inside where Robert James was at the table with a book, his brow furrowed the way Hugh's did when he was concentrating, and Clara was in her corner with a collection of rocks she had been organizing by color and size for several days, which was a project everyone in the house had learned to leave alone. Rosa was at the stove. "Shepard fixed the fence post," Sallie said. "I know," Rosa said. "I told him to," Sallie laughed. "Of course you did." "It needed doing," Rosa said, and gave her a look that was fond and satisfied in equal measure, the look of a woman who has watched something difficult become something good and considers this a proper day's work. Hugh came in just before dinner, washing the dust from his hands at the basin on the porch, and came through the door and found his family at the table and the stove going and the light warm and low, and he stood in the doorway for a moment just looking at it. Robert James looked up. "Papa, I have a question." "I would be very surprised if you didn't," Hugh said. "What is the biggest number?" Hugh sat down at his place. "That," he said, "is a truly excellent question." Robert James straightened with the pleasure of someone confirmed in their approach to the world. Sallie set dinner on the table and sat and looked at the faces around it. Her son with his questions and her daughter with her organized rocks and her husband, who had ridden 3 days with an envelope and a direction, and had never once stopped asking why, and Rosa who had cooked for her father and for her, and whom she thought of simply as family, and the ranch outside the windows going quiet in the evening, and the mountains going dark, and the whole solid, good, real weight of the life she had built from what had been given to her and what she had made herself. She picked up her fork. "Eat while it's hot," she said, and they did.